From Software's Soul series is known for a lot of great things. I think if I were to ask someone, what's the one word you would use to describe From Software's games, they would probably give the answer challenging. Or at the very least, I feel it would be some variation of challenging. And part of that word, challenging, is what makes From Software's bosses as unique as they are. A hard and challenging fight doesn't automatically mean it's good, but a hard fight that makes sense within the world, with an interesting moveset, is a recipe that's been working for a long time with no signs of slowing down. Bosses that From Software create gain more of my respect as time goes on. We have all played a game where the bad guy was hyped up to be super powerful and menacing, and by the time you get there, they are a pushover, and in many ways, you feel let down. Even as someone like myself, who doesn't follow the lore and story with these games, immersion is added when you have a very specific mood that is set with the boss, such as Ludwig. If you have a cutscene as powerful as his mid-phase transition, and he was a pushover, he wouldn't be as memorable. It's rare for a From Software boss to miss the mark on aspects such as this. The examples I gave can easily lead into the difficulty argument, but hey, we are not here to discuss that. We are here for bosses. You clicked on this video to see the top 10 bosses in the Souls series. The last talking point that I have to say about this list is that this is a Soulsborne list for bosses. So Sekiro bosses are not going to be a talking point because I plan to do a Sekiro video on its birthday. And now that that long overdone speech is over, let's talk bosses. Starting with Mohg, the Lord of Blood. In a few of my past videos, I have said that I see Elden Ring's bosses as a mixed bag. Part of a mixed bag is genuinely great stuff, and Mohg takes the cake for this. I think Mohg has a lot of unique and creative ideas in his kit. Ideas that I feel are rarely used as well as his fight achieves. My absolute favorite thing about Mohg is that he forces you to be aware of your positioning at all times with his blood throw and his blood whip attacks in phase 2. It's not the act of dodging the initial toss, it's about maneuvering throughout the fight arena to avoid the bleed buildup. Other bosses like Millennia also demand that you position correctly, but Millennia doesn't force you to engage with this in unique and creative ways. The only thing that Millennia demands is for you to not be shoved into the edges of her fight arena, because you as the player need space to deal with Waterfowl Dance. And as long as you're somewhere within running room and you know how to dodge Waterfowl itself, you should be fine. Mohg, on the other hand, can take full advantage of his arena with his blood throw, and with his second phase where the blood will be throughout large chunks of the fight arena. I find it to be a very engaging way to play, and what I am describing of not just worrying about boss attacks but also being aware of your positioning is why I love gank bosses as much as I do. You will be seeing a few duo bosses later on, but out of all of the other bosses on this list, I think Mohg demands a skill that is rarely forced onto you, and that is much more than just proper positioning. It's excellent positioning. Throughout this video, I will be commenting on the original soundtracks that are presented throughout each boss, and most of them, if not all of them, have a pattern. They are prominent and attention-grabbing. The chorus in the background of Mohg's fight is not something you can listen to and tune out, it's always present. I don't have enough musical talent to articulate why I like most of these themes in these fights, but I do enjoy every single original soundtrack that these bosses have. One last thing with Mohg is I'm not going to fail to mention his phase transition. I remember when Elden Ring came out, some Souls players from past games were talking about how the health drain transition is bullshit because it's unavoidable damage. I never thought it was bullshit, but I remember trying multiple ways to cleanse this debuff. Before I gave up and accepted that I won't be figuring it out, I was trying the soap consumable thinking that would work. It did not. The main argument I would hear for this is, the Souls games are built on the fact that every tick of damage you take is your fault, and Mohg goes against that philosophy. And I just don't agree with that. I can't recall any moment where From Software said that this statement was their design philosophy, and secondly, I actually kind of like the heal and health drain he does. I'm going to be talking about Lady Maria here, so be warned in case you don't want spoilers. Lady Maria will be on this list, and she is an excellent fight. Her and Mohg have something in common, and it's their use of blood. No, just kidding. It's their second phase, and in Lady Maria's case, her 3 phases are too good to pass up. The sad thing about Lady Maria is that you can more or less slam bam her face with the R1 button until she becomes an actual fight. Her stagger is so easy to exploit that it becomes her whole first phase, and by the time you get her down to half HP, now she's cooking. So what does this have to do with Mohg exactly? Well, Mohg's first half doesn't suffer as much as Lady Maria, but his second half is superb. And when he does his health drain, he heals past the half HP mark, making it so you get to enjoy his prolonged fight and not burst him down like you do with Malekith, for example, on his phase transition. I also understand that when you do have the Purifying Crystal, he still heals, but for someone who has been playing these games for a while now, I enjoy a mechanic that forces me to essentially have my healing cut significantly, even if it is a bit cheap. From Software tried new ideas with bosses like Mohg or with the Blasphemous Claw with Malekith, which I actually dislike. So yeah, Mohg is good, and I actually like his health drain. It adds for a harder and longer phase too. Good stuff, FromSoft.
Beasts all over the shop.
I have Father Gascoigne on this list because I would say he is one of the better introduction bosses of the series. I think all around Genichiro is the best, but as I mentioned in the intro, I won't be including Sekiro bosses on this list. Margit may be the best teacher of all since he was so challenging for new players that they eventually left and came back when they had adequate stats. I don't include Cleric Beast as the introduction boss of Bloodborne because he's technically optional. Although Margit is too. Margit is a bit more unique in my mind. Anyway, leading up to Gascoigne is a bit of a unique experience, and I think I can speak to that firsthand. Bloodborne was my first Souls game ever, and I played it at launch. I remember having to farm for blood vials, and I didn't fully understand how parrying worked. I was stuck on him for longer than I care to admit, but now I can go into his boss room and fight him with no issue. Gascoigne really shows Bloodborne's beauty, and it's something that I value more and more as time goes on. When you match his aggression and don't play as defensively like you would say in Dark Souls 1, he and most of Bloodborne's better bosses feel like a constant dopamine hit that never stops. While he may be a bit easy on repeat playthrough since you're a god now and you can parry your way through 90% of the game, he also has a trait that I'd only give to Genichiro. If you can beat Genichiro and Father Gascoigne, then I'd say you have the skills to beat the rest of the base game, discluding DLCs and optional areas or fights such as Demon of Hatred. The last thing about him being a great tutorial boss is his rampaging beast form with the last quarter of his health bar. I would say that not having it be on the halfway point was the better decision. His beast form quickly forces the player to twist their brains since it's a new moveset because the second phase is a lot more chaotic. The music also kicks up a notch, and with his form being such a small health percentage, it's going to be harder to play the memorization game and outsmart the AI. I also can't forget to mention the music box, and I have to say that I don't use these kind of items in From Software fights in general. I didn't use them on Moog or Margit, but I can say that I think the music box feels a little bit more natural than the other two examples I just gave. The first level of Bloodborne is probably From Software's hardest first level they've ever made, and I think most players would have naturally found this music box since they are exploring more than the usual first level. Bloodborne's hunter fights are usually, but not always, the best fights in Bloodborne, and with Bloodborne coming up on its 9th birthday this year, I am glad that I get to have a few of these bosses on my list. The first thing that Pontiff does that catches my attention is when you initially enter his boss room. Most of the time he does this lunge swipe that reminds me a lot of Gwyn from Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 3 has an astounding amount of callbacks from the entire Souls series in that game, so how intentional this was is not something I can confidently say. While Pontiff's first phase isn't something completely unique to the series, he still has a lot of things that I enjoy. The speed of this fight feels like one of Dark Souls 3's faster fights in the game. His two weapons also have distinct fight styles that enrich part of what makes him unique. His flame sword that is in his right hand is the more traditional attack where you see the attack coming and dodge based on how close it is to hitting you. But his purple weapon is more of a quick thrust weapon. This weapon seems to be the opposite, where you have to dodge preemptively because it's such a quick animation that dodging when you see the startup seems less than ideal. A quick example is right here how he moves his arm back and that's my tail. If I dodge when I see the thrust, then I'm going to get hit. It's a style that complements each other wonderfully, almost making it feel like the best of both worlds. While the background music is apparent, you can tell it's ramping up to something, and like most great From Software fights, the music in Phase 2 is not something you can ignore. The tone change with the music aligns with Pontiff summoning his shadow to fight alongside him. His second phase does add a few new moves, my favorite one being the butt slam, but the main bit of fun continues with fighting him and the shadow at the same time. Pontiff is one of the better fights, and I have almost no complaints about him in general. In case any of you are wondering what the Soul Level 1 experience was like, well, I'll show you, and it mainly turned into a parrying game. Sadly, I went with the easier option instead of playing it normally. Overall, I'd give Pontiff Sulyvahn a nicely earned 9 out of 10. Reading the comments about Midir specifically is what I am most excited about because Midir is one of those From Software bosses that people either slaughter or think he's one of the harder fights in the series. I don't think he's a pushover, I definitely wouldn't go that far, but I also have never struggled with him outside of my Soul Level 1 run. And on the Soul Level 1 run, I struggled with a handful of bosses more. In case you didn't know, Midir had a lot of discussion about him when he was first released. In fact, the original Dark Souls Twitter described him to be the ultimate challenge for Souls players. It's quite intriguing to read that because most players that I hear talk about Midir describe him to be on the easier side of things. But I can also see people not clicking with him and struggling with him in that case. If Midir isn't an easy click with you, then everything about him being this challenging makes sense. He has a laser beam of dark magic that can nearly blink you out of existence, his run back is annoying, and he has a lot of health. I would like to hear from people in the comments if they had a hard time with him because they were solely focused on attacking his tail and feet. If that's the case, then I can most definitely put my question to rest. I'll talk more about this later, but with my first kill on Sister Frida, I didn't click with her at all, so I can understand the sentiment of something feeling gruesomely challenging. I think I've rambled on enough about the context of difficulty, so let's talk about what puts him on this list. Something that sticks out in my mind is that the Souls series itself has a lot of mixed dragon fights. I guess that statement still holds ground with Elden Ring having some good ones in the beginning, but they feel all over the place later on, especially in Caelid. But with Midir specifically, From Software made a very clear and intent decision by locking your camera directly on his head. When I fight him this way, it feels like I am engaging in the classic dance that makes great bosses so special. His swipe and buy attacks are telegraphed to make it more of an endurance fight as time goes on, but he also has his laser and fire to split the fight apart and not make it so telegraphed. If your tactic when fighting Midir was to dodge or run underneath him, then I would say his attacks are going to be the opposite of telegraphed because his size is so large that you won't be able to keep track of what he's actually doing. Not only that, but he does have a fire breathing attack that will catch you if you're underneath him. His second phase has a move that stands out a lot to me, and he'll summon humanity spirits from Dark Souls 1. Or at least they look like humanity spirits to me. The only downside of phase 2 is that if you've only been attacking his head, he will go into the famous stagger phase that we all love. On my run here, you can see that knocked out a little over 3,500 HP. He also takes some time to recover, so you can nearly kill him outright when that stagger is triggered. I didn't think of this until I was watching my footage for this video, and I wonder how much more I would enjoy the fight if he didn't have this stagger. Maybe they could have even knocked some health off from his health pool to even him out. Lastly, I put Midir here because having non-humanoid enemies is always a welcome break from the usual humanoid enemies we fight. That's not to say that I love Elden Beast or Bed of Chaos because they're different, but it's a nice change aesthetically that I always welcome. Okay, so if you've made it here, then I have some good news, and it's that all of the bosses from here on out are extremely close in quality. In fact, I would say that if you judge these bosses by the fights, and only the fights, I'd say they're pretty much all equally great. What sets them apart is their music, atmosphere, aesthetic, and most importantly, personal preference. This whole list is subjective, but I think that from here on out, this list is going to be pretty predictable. But if I was making a tier list, I would have all of these fights from this point on in the S tier. And if you've yet to play Bloodborne, then I'm sorry Sony has completely locked away one of the best games ever made on an old 30 FPS console. But now,
Cosm. Or some say Cosm.
I haven't really spoken too much about introduction cutscenes, and when you see a cutscene happen before the actual fight, chances are you're in for one of the better fights in the game. I'll try and save most of my cutscene thoughts for the later bosses, and this is a compliment, but Orphan's cutscene is so bleak and odd that saying what it is out loud kind of makes me laugh. From what I can tell, his introduction cutscene is the orphan crawling out of a womb, and then he continues to sob at the moon. Again, it sounds so odd to say that it makes me respect it more. I have more cutscene analysis for later fights, but that's all I can say for this one. The first thing that strikes me with this fight is, oddly enough, his boss arena. A large square or rectangle always gets the job done, but when you have a fight zone that is so different, it adds on to immersion and makes it easier to forget that you're just playing a game. It's a small trait that I've grown to appreciate more as From Software's games have gone on. The Orphan also highlights part of Bloodborne's pureness with its trick weapons. If you're a longtime viewer of this channel, then you'll know that I have somewhat of a predilection with big swords. They're kind of my go-to. Every time. And with the Orphan specifically, I found it easier and more enjoyable for myself to not use the greatsword part of Ludwig's Holy Blade, and just use the default sword version. I found the Orphan to be so fast that relentless hit trading worked better than the slower trade that would entail with the trick variation. I have always preferred Bloodborne's trick system over the Souls arsenal, even if the goals with Souls weapons and Bloodborne's weapons aren't the same. I enjoy the fewer set of weapons that are more quality. Using the basic sword variation also doesn't take away from his fight in any way, it really only adds on to it, in my opinion. It gives me more options in combos and fights, and doesn't feel like the right answer you should use at all times. If you've ever used Bloodhound Step against Millennia, chances are it felt like the best way to play in that fight. That's obviously not to suggest it's the objective choice, because it will always go down to personal preference. What I want to elucidate with Orphan's fight is that he feels like part of Bloodborne's combat at its peak. In the base game of Bloodborne, I found parrying to be too obvious of when I should and should not shoot. I had to hold myself back and not parry my way through the whole game. But with Orphan, I was having a hard time consistently parrying him. Obviously, if I wanted to, I could study his whole moveset and become a parry god, but it does feel like FromSoft made an attempt to make it harder to parry him over the base game bosses. So when I'm not easy moding the whole game, Orphan is fast, relentless, and has a vast moveset to always keep me focused. Phase 1 isn't a complete pushover like with Lady Maria, and if you match his speed and aggression, he can definitely overpower you, but there's something about Orphan specifically, where it's an adrenaline rush of constant attacks. In another universe, we would get a Bloodborne 2, but I feel like with what Bloodborne's combat is, he reaches the peak of adrenaline of constant attacks and constant trading. I would say the same thing with Artorias and Dark Souls 1, and sadly he didn't make this list, but I just had to mention him somewhere. While Lady Maria and Ludwig will be on this list, I do think that Orphan has my personal preference of this fight between Phase 1 and Phase 2. Phase 2 feels like a natural evolution, and as I said, peaks Bloodborne's combat. I have the other fights higher for other reasons, but I don't want to shove Orphan to the side, because just like I said, these fights are so close that numbering them feels like a disservice. But speaking of natural progression with Phase 2, he doesn't become a completely new fight like Ludwig, and that's a good thing in my opinion. Ludwig keeps his unique status in my mind because of how much of a transition he presents going from Phase 1 to Phase 2. My favorite part of Orphan's second phase, oddly enough, isn't the lightning itself, but his scream that summons the lightning. It sounds like a mixture of desperation and agony in one scream. While everyone's opinion will be different, I find him to be perfectly placed as the last trio in Bloodborne. Ludwig is my favorite, Lady Maria is the flashiest, and the Orphan captures Bloodborne's combat. I'll speak about this at the very end of the video, but From Software always delivers with DLC, and I hope you like DLC bosses because there are more to come. Before I talk about Sister Frida herself, I want to admit that I am biased towards duo bosses. The Souls series has had so many misses with putting two enemies with movesets that don't complement and flow well with each other. I think the obvious one is Godskin Duo from Elden Ring, and I know this is completely unfair since I said I wouldn't include Sekiro on this list, but the duo Guardian Ape in that game. Oh god, that one fucking sucks. The highs of a duo boss can reach a level that is almost unique and unmatched over a standard 1v1 fight, for my taste. And while Sister Frida may not be a true duo boss because only a third of her fight is a 1v2, she still sits up there in my mind of classic duo bosses. I mentioned earlier in the Midir section is that sometimes people understandably have a certain few bosses that they just don't click with, and Sister Frida was one of them for me. If I never did my soul level 1 run on Dark Souls 3, I never would have fully understood her flow. The clips I am showing you right now should perfectly show that I didn't understand her invisible move. Sister Frida has this invisible move where she can perform one of three actions. She can essentially do a Bloodborne dash to the left, to the right, or she can do a Darth Jar Jar force jump behind you. While this is only one move, she will do this a lot in Phase 1 and 3. I was trying to rely too much on audio and neglected to realize that the Frost Trail would follow her character model. And now that I've said that out loud, I realize how dumb that sounds. Of course it was something as simple as that. Anyway, as I said, I didn't click with her. I would also say that she is the fastest boss in Dark Souls 3. She's close to the fastest enemy, but this guy here takes the cake. And now that I look back at my footage, he kind of looks funny when he attacks. Before I talk about the meat with this fight, I think most people would say I am putting Sister Frida too high on this list. I assume most people would have her in the top 10, but maybe not the top 5. The reasons that come to mind as to why I think people will say I have her higher than most is because of a few things. Starting off, her first phase is just a warm-up for Phase 3. Phase 1 and Phase 3 are quite similar, just like how Orphan's two phases are to his fight. They're more natural evolutions and a complete change like Ludwig. Secondly, she is technically a duo boss, but most of the fight is actually fighting her and her only. Only a third of this fight is the duo, and when you are doing Phase 2, her demeanor changes drastically from Phase 1 to Phase 2. She's more timid, and not as hostile because now you're dealing with Father Ariandel. If you only focus on the father, the second phase should be easy in terms of a duo boss. But similar to the Ring City Bats, she will throw her range attack at you a lot, which is the Ice Trail. And sometimes their attacks will overlap, forcing you to become more defensive. I'll also talk about this with the Ring City Bats, but unlike Ord and Smo, their second phase doesn't fall into the trap of running in circles and waiting for a proper opening. While part of any boss is finding the right opening, finding them with her feels more natural. When I replayed Dark Souls 1 about a year back, I gained more respect for Ornn and Smo because I was constantly on the lookout for an opening instead of mostly finding one melee and one in ranged form. That's not to say Ornn and Smo are perfect because they're not, but these two fights are more drastic than I remembered. I also have a confession. The transition from Phase 2 to Phase 3 is one of the more fond moments that stick out in my mind with the Souls games. I know, it's kind of odd to hear that from a series that has so many great moments. This definitely isn't the most memorable memory I have, but I remember feeling so caught off guard and so astounded by how hard FromSoft caught me with this. It's almost like some of those Sekiro moments without spoiling them. When you beat Phase 2 of this fight, you actually get a Titanite chunk as a reward. The music stopped and it genuinely felt like the end of me. Then you hear some dialogue and get that oh shit moment when you realize it's not over. It's almost like when an anime character dies but has main character syndrome so they have to be resurrected. Imagine that, but good. The orchestra in the background nearly screaming at you with what I mentioned earlier is truly unforgettable. At least for me it is. The music is going at full speed along with the fight. Her third phase is more of a natural progression of phase 1 along with her black flame and some longer and flashy combos. I sadly have the least to say about phase 3, but the last thing I do want to comment on about this fight is that if you force me to make a hardest Souls bosses tier list, I would definitely have this fight at number 2, only trailing behind Millennia. I've tried to state this as many times as possible, and it's that I always had a hard time with her, but I truly do think she's up there with the hardest fights. I would say that if you're not summoning, without a doubt Millennia is the hardest, but hey, that's just what I think.
Oh, I know very well how the secrets beckon so sweetly. Only an honest death will kill you now. Liberate you from your wild curiosity.
The saddest part about Lady Maria's fight is that I can't recall my first memories with her. Part of the reason that's so sad is because in the level leading up to her, you have a handful of NPCs calling out to her and constantly reminding you of her presence.
Lady Maria, save me, please. Is that you, Lady Maria?
Lady Maria, please take my hand, please.
She's also on the cover of the DLC art, so pretty much everyone was expecting her to be a fight. If I ever tried to give a fuck about the lore, Bloodborne would be at the very top if I ever tried to decrypt Miyazaki's lore and storytelling. The reason I mention this is because when I replayed through the DLC for this video, I kept trying to think of other bosses that were as heavily alluded to as she was. Even the doll is modeled after Lady Maria, so I guess it shows how impactful they wanted her to be no matter what. I'm going to step out on a limb here, but she may even be the true Artorias of Bloodborne. I don't have all that much to say about her cutscene besides it keeps adding onto one of Bloodborne's strengths, and it's the strong atmosphere that is sewn deep within its core. I think she aesthetically looks the coolest with her armor, cape, and her blonde hair sticking out of her cap. With the gameplay side of her, I can easily say that at all stages, her moves seem well animated and are quite flashy. The saddest thing I can say is with just a few tweaks, I think she could have easily been the best fight in the Old Hunters. I wouldn't mind her having more health and, most importantly, more hyper armor in her first phase. As controversial as Millennia is at times, she at least isn't an R1 bot that takes blow after blow to the face and powers up later on. Sadly, Lady Maria is an R1 bot that takes blow after blow to the face and powers up later on. This tactic is sadly viable in all three of her phases. It's really saddening that her whole encounter has a great atmosphere, quite possibly the best OST, but definitely one of the better ones in the series, and she had such a great lead up, only for her to be a punching bag. I also wish she had more health in general because when she is stabbing herself to phase 2, you can sneak in multiple hits to continue damaging her. Maybe From Software agrees with me since Godric's transition cutscene seems to have a lot of heavy damage mitigation built into it. She also has a phase 3 transformation and you can more or less do the same thing. I know this can be seen as a little nitpicky since it's up to the player to decide how easy or hard they want to make the game. But I still think that if From Software added more HP or gave her damage mitigation, it would have led to a more enjoyable fight. If you watched the section on Orphan of Kos, you heard me say that parrying him felt harder than parrying most base game bosses. And now that we're on Lady Maria, I can safely say that I think From Software took this into all account. As I've said before, sometimes the player has to meet the game halfway when it comes to difficulty, but From Software took that extra step. I'll show a few clips on screen of me properly parrying Maria, and some extra blood effects would actually hit me, making it so I couldn't get the optimal punish. From what I can tell, you have to be positioned better or time the parry perfectly. I don't want my words to be misconstrued, and I think this is a really good thing. It forces you to twist your brain or get better, and I'm really glad that these extra steps were taken for a more respectable dance. Hunter fights in Bloodborne are some of my favorites in the game, and even though I think she could have had more health and more hyper armor, I'm glad to have her this high on the list. To conclude my thoughts, I think the sum of her parts add on to the fight more than the actual fight. If she is a 9 out of 10 fight, then I would say everything else about her is a 10. It's why I have Ludwig higher than her. The flashy animations, OST, cutscene, aesthetic are all some of my favorite parts of FromSoft's work. If only there was a boss replay mode, so I can hinder my character and spend hours struggling with her like I wish I could. Now that we're at the number 3 spot, I will be commenting a lot more on Shadow of the Erdtree since I think each of these bosses brings something completely unique to the table that I'd like to see in Elden Ring's DLC. I know I just got done praising Lady Maria, and I think she's unique too. This applies to number 3, what we're currently on, and number 2, Demon in Pain and Demon from Below. Let's start off with a fact. Dragon Slayer armor isn't a duo fight. Just because you occasionally have his partner thing, whatever the fuck it is, shooting substances at you, doesn't make him a duo fight. There's even one health bar after all, and you can't attack the guy in the air. And before you leave your comment saying, what the fuck are you even saying? Of course this isn't a gank fight. Why are you saying something so obvious? And to answer your question, my kind viewer, that's because these two encapsulate that idea and pass gank fights in all the best ways. I think that these two offer the perfect variety between ranged attacks, like how I mentioned with Sister Frida, and waiting for your turn and finding the proper opening. They work really well. I think this fight in terms of mechanics is close to perfect and relit some magic that was missing since Ornn and Smough. We all know that Dark Souls 3 has a lot of callbacks to the prior Dark Souls titles, mainly Dark Souls 1, and the Ring City is a send-off to the entire Souls series. Which is why I'll be starting with that. It's definitely not coincidental that this fight takes place in Dark Souls 1's Firelink Shrine, and adds something that I don't recall has happened since Ornn and Smough. It's that depending on which of these bats you kill last, the 1 versus 1 fight will have a few altered moves. One of them will rain Hellfire Balls, and the other has a Homelander laser beam. In case you don't remember how Dark Souls 1 did this, depending on which of these two you killed first, the other would become more powerful for the second phase. It's a really great add-on. And what makes me have as much respect for this fight as I do, is that both of these fights are great in their own ways. The first phase isn't something you deal with while you wait for the real fun to turn on, and vice versa. I would say the execution of this fight is better than Sister Frida because phase 2 of this fight is a powered up fight of the bats in phase 1, but you have the added challenge that there are 2 of them in phase 1. Sister Frida's phase 1 is essentially a warm-up for phase 3 and nothing more. Gank fights are clearly hard to properly pull off, and with the rarity of a great one, you'll come to realize that they usually turn into a 1v1 fight at some point in the fight. I want to be clear that I understand Elden Ring has a ton of gank fights in the catacombs, but I'm going to disregard these because FromSoft didn't have too many options besides throwing in 2 random enemies together to add variety. I also realize that for the most part, Godskin Duo is a true gank fight, but there is the occasional 1v1 moment. What I want to note is that I appreciate how you are forced to kill both of them before you can start the second phase. With Sister Frida, I would focus on the father and do my best to burst him down and try and ignore the counterpart to that fight. The same thing with Ornn and Smough because you only need to kill one to trigger the next phase. It adds on to the endurance test of this fight, and it's something that I appreciate a lot. With the second phase of this fight, it's more of what phase 1 has with a few moves added on. I specifically want to note that this fight was hands down the hardest fight on my Soul Level 1 run, and this move you're seeing right now would full on one-shot me. If I said that everything surrounding Lady Maria is better than her fight, then I think the opposite is true of this fight. I think the fight is the best part, and the music, aesthetic, boss arena, and everything else is in second place here. All of these things I just mentioned I greatly enjoy, the fight itself just comes in first place. I said I would comment on Shadow of the Erdtree now, and I think that Elden Ring has so much untapped potential with gank fights in the series. As simple as it sounds, I think the jump button would be the best add-on that past games couldn't properly take advantage of. I'm currently imagining a duo boss where one of the attacks is high and one of them is low, so you have to jump through the middle of their string. Or even put one of the demons Fire Spit in Elden Ring, but it's another mid that you have to jump over. This isn't specific to the boss, but I really hope that Shadow of the Erdtree emphasizes using the jump button more strategically in fights. Of course, there are a few moves I would jump in Elden Ring, but I more or less became Jump King himself and jump attacked my whole way through the game. I hope this doesn't sound too repetitive, so I'm going to mention it really quickly, and it's that I've made this clear on my channel before and in this video, but in case you just skipped this part and didn't listen to the others, then I should let you know that I don't follow the story in these games. I only mention this because Ludwig and his cinematics most definitely have a rich and compelling story if you were to decipher the cryptic nature of these games. What I'm about to say is going to be a very surface level interpretation of a masterfully crafted cutscene, but this cutscene shows Ludwig, who seems defeated, and is a shell of his former self, to the point where you may even pity him. He grasps his weapon, made even more impressive by being the Moonlight Greatsword, and evolves, transcending into a formidable foe. Usually when I see a Souls cutscene, it's really just to set the mood, and Ludwig's cutscene definitely does that. It does that very well. But it got me thinking beyond the mood and what it actually meant. I knew what was coming, and I knew his second phase was completely different. The only change I would make to Ludwig is to make him have 2 full health bars similar to what they've done in other From Software games. So the first and second phase have a new health bar, and you have to deplete both of them to 0. Once you deplete Ludwig the Accursed, Ludwig, the Holy Blade, has his own health bar. Almost like the Accursed side of him died, and the warrior side came back to life. For some, it would have thrown them off guard thinking the fight was over. taking away their elated emotion. But before we move on, I think if you gathered up all of the Souls cutscenes and had a vote, this one would be the most popular among fans. I think it's tied with Gale in terms of my personal favorite. Going on to Phase 2 is when the entire Souls series may be at its peak. Phase 2 is masterful. It's truly a work of art. I always tend to gravitate towards brute strength characters in fiction, and Ludwig exemplifies this perfectly. Everything about what he does speaks loudly to my tastes. His stature, strength, and dignity. There is something about wielding Ludwig's Holy Blade in this fight while his second phase runs on all cylinders. If Gale wasn't the end of Dark Souls, I think these two would be swapped on my list, but the fact that Ludwig was able to set such a high standard with the first boss of this DLC is also something to note. I say the exact same thing about Artorias in Dark Souls 1, and with Artorias, FromSoft didn't want to make a good boss that players will remember. They demanded and put a lot of care and attention to make this something that players won't forget. I know with how much I love these games, it's going to sound a bit biased, but if I try and think about other bosses that came out around the time Ludwig did, there really wouldn't even be a contest because Ludwig and most of From Software's bosses are ahead of their time. Sadly, Ludwig is one of the shorter sections of this video, and that's because I have praised him enough. I can offer very little in terms of critiques. From Software never fails to surprise me, but if Shadow of the Erdtree doesn't have a boss that matches Ludwig and Gale, I wouldn't be upset. I know they are capable of doing it, but these two fights are as close to perfect as I've seen. And now, we're on to Gale. I'm not exactly sure what can be said about Gale that hasn't already been said. I've never once in my life seen someone actively say they dislike Gale. Although, now that I've said that, I'm sure the comments will change that. But hey, there's a first time for everything. Gale is one last hurrah for the Dark Souls series. He's hard, he's a cool knight, he has great music, moves, animations, cutscenes, and a great boss arena. There really is not an aspect of Gale's fight that is weak. See what I mean? You've heard that before. So I'm actually going to skip all of that, and I'm going to give you a 30-second review before I say what I want. Gale is a masterpiece. He's my favorite boss in any video game ever. He's the final goodbye to the Dark Souls series, and I love everything about him. He was also hard on my Soul Level 1 run, but wasn't the hardest fight. But I hope you enjoyed what I said because I'm sure you have similar thoughts to mine. What I want to make crystal clear is that ever since we hit the number 6 mark, all of the bosses have been DLC bosses. I didn't do this on purpose, it's just really how I felt. From Software can design DLC bosses for late game builds and more dedicated players, which is the category I, and most likely you, fall into. With Shadow of the Erdtree most likely coming out soon, or hopefully coming out soon. Seriously, we don't know when it can come out. It can come out tomorrow or some other random fucking time. But for now, let's just assume it's soon. FromSoft has never let us down with DLC. Their DLC has always been some of the best content I've ever played in any game, ever. So if you've only played Elden Ring, and maybe one other Souls game, I think getting excited for the DLC is okay in this case. Hype can lead to warped expectations, but From Software has never missed with their DLCs. And a quick reminder as to why Sekiro bosses were not included on this list, I'm going to do a Sekiro video on its birthday, and Sekiro is so different, so I wanted to keep this list a little bit more focused, since Bloodborne and the Souls bosses share more in common. Although if you do want to see the Sekiro video, then feel free to do the thing. Regardless, I hope you have a good day.